Welcome to Wildlife Investments, where we discuss wildlife research, habitat, hunting, and land management with our panel of leading resource managers. Wildlife Investments, resource management by scientists. Hey, real quick, before we start the podcast, we hope to see you at our second Wild Turkey Management Academy that we're holding February 28th, 2026 in Eufaula, Alabama. The course is going to be taught by Drs. Marcus Lashley and Dr. Will Goolsby. It's a one-day classroom course. It's going to cover everything from the basics of wild turkey biology, how to make management decisions, managing different cover types for turkeys. Marcus and Will are even going to get down in the weeds, laying out different properties, walking through different scenarios that they've encountered so that you can apply those to properties you manage. Go to wildlifeinvestments.com, click on our education events page. You'll see all the information you need to sign up. We hope to see you the end of February in Eufaula.
Today, we are going to talk about one of those topics that's often neglected, people get sick and tired of hearing about, and that is the importance of doe harvests and keeping your population under control relative to the habitat, and what a big impact that can have on your success and the success of your management program.
We got three of us today: Dr. Bronson Strickland, our resident deer management researcher and expert.
Good to be here. This is a really, really important topic, so we wanted to make sure we gave it some airtime and just refresh people's memories of how critical this topic is.
We also have with us Bonner Powell. Bonner is another one of our habitat management deer turkey experts. Bonner, how's it going?
Pretty good. Happy to be here. Excited to talk about shooting more deer.
And I'm Moriah, another one of our deer management consultants. And we're excited to have this conversation with everybody. And we're going to jump right in it. So I'm so sick of people not shooting enough deer and then complaining that nothing's changing all the time.
Is that what we're going to start it with? Just that line right there? That's what's...
Yes.
No welcome to nothing. That's the teacher.
I'm sick of it.
I'm so sick of people not shooting deer and then complaining. I do think it is a valuable point that there's only so much we can do with it. Like, it's kind of like what Bronson talks about with the seesaw. You know, there's only so high we can get habitat value, and without proper harvest, it kind of always is going. You know, I mean, they're going to adapt. It doesn't matter how much burning you do or how much food you have in the woods during the summertime if you've got a deer per 3 acres.
Right. And it's crazy how much money people will spend on feed.
Yep.
And if we really pull back the covers, the reason you're putting out feed is to try to improve the nutritional plane. But what is always ignored is the other side of the nutritional plane is supply and demand. And no one wants to manage demand. We think about supply all the time, and we talk about habitat management all the time, and people do it. And I'm glad that people do habitat management and we can, implement that on properties. But I mean, we put out that figure recently, it's just very much so just kind of a visualization of how our brains work with that. You increase the ceiling, that invisible ceiling of nutritional quality, and then no one does anything, and suddenly you went from having 60 deer per square mile, they were poor quality with poor quality habitat, the better quality habitat, 80 deer per square mile, and poor quality deer. Like, is that really what we want?
Right. Yeah, I mean, man, people just don't shoot deer, eat deer, kill deer, regardless of bucks or does, man. I mean, what'd they say, Bronson, at that thing we were at the other night? The average licensed hunter in Mississippi is like 1.5.
Yeah, it varies around 1.5.
Yeah.
Might be 1.3, 1.6, but yeah, 1.5.
1.5.
And just a decade ago, it was 2 point something.
Really?
Yeah, 10 years ago, it was, almost, a little bit more than 2.5 or something like that.
I know from when I worked in Indiana and North Carolina, looking at that data, both of those states regionally very different, the kind of hunters very different, and the way they view doe harvest very different. Both of them, it was right at about 1.3 or something. It's
Mhm.
consistent, I'm assuming across the whitetail range for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's being able to deal with only X amount of deer carcasses, your time and expense to get it processed.
It's something I think you and I, Bronson, have talked about this. That lot, the idea of being able to quantify all of the forage that's out there. There seems to me, and I think you and I have seen this on some properties, a disconnect between the assumed value or the assumed quality of deer you should have versus what a property is experiencing, because there's so much food everywhere, it seems like the deer should not be starving. And I think across a property like Bottomland Hardwoods, you could quantify how much poundage of food there is. Food plots, you could quantify how much poundage of food there is. And if we use habitat management, we can increase that poundage. But I think one of a major point that isn't talked about with just the tonnage answer is the quality part and variety. And I wonder, kind of going to the Fred Provenza nourishment idea, how much value we get by having different cover types managed differently, therefore different species and tonnage of different species. To me, that seems like the ultimate combination that actually gives you true quality.
It is.
Because I think even in like southern Mississippi, you could have a lot of really well managed pines, but if that plant community is dominated by 5 or 6 species, you might have a lot of tonnage of quote unquote deer forage, but those deer are probably lacking some important, at least micronutrients and maybe even macros during different times of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And that the deer density thing ties into that a lot too.
No question about it. And so we know this is going on, but here's a way that we've all seen that verifies what's going on is and just 2 examples I give all the time. You go to an ag environment, soybean rich, and the deer are wearing the soybeans out completely as we would expect. But then you look over on the periphery of that field where there's giant ragweed, and they wear out the giant ragweed. Meaning that's an oversimplification of the diversity of a deer's diet, but they need something else. Now, in this case, it may not be they need a nutrient from a positive tissue building standpoint, but maybe they're needing to counter the chemical makeup of all the soybeans that they ate. Maybe they need some more roughage, but there's some type of interaction there to where they're overdoing it with this one package of chemicals, this particular plant. They've got to buffer it with another package of chemicals, the giant ragweed. And then quantitatively, the South Texas example, when this fed, you see a decided shift in the diet of deer in a fed enclosure. They start eating things that deer normally don't eat in that environment because of that phenomenon. They're getting too much of a good thing, and they've got to counterbalance it with other chemicals from other plants.
And then there's too much of a bad thing. I think of the coastal plain. In my experiences, the coastal plain of North Carolina. I haven't really spent a lot of time in the coastal plain of Mississippi, but you can have a well-managed forest, and there's a lot of deer forage. Again, coastal plain of North Carolina, in a low basal area pine or longleaf forest, there's never a time of the year that there isn't a green leaf for deer to eat that deer consume. I mean, I've watched them eat gallberry, a lot of gallberry, eat yopon. And when you look at the understory of that forest, it is mostly wiregrass, yopon, gallberry, and there's some other waxy leaf species. And I've had this conversation with people. I can't prove this. This is me stepping outside of the scientific bounds of what I can prove. But I think if we could do an experiment, you could probably explain a lot of the variation in antler quality and body mass in that region, not by the amount of tonnage of food available, but by the presence and availability of high quality foods. Like, for instance, you rarely see common ragweed, horseweed, any of the dominant forbs that we get in central Mississippi and across the central United States. When you disturb soil, you get a pretty rich plant community. You don't get that in the coastal plain. But I bet one of the reasons you don't see a lot of those is that they probably get consumed by deer so quickly, and they're underrepresented in that plant community already because they get dominated and out-competed by those waxy leaf species that hold their leaves throughout the year. So my wager is
quality is just slightly above dirt, by the way,
Yeah, but they can chew it and keep going, and
yeah.
to the landowner, hey, I've got plenty of green everywhere. I don't have a deer harvest issue. There's plenty of food everywhere, and the deer are always eating. And so I think that could be true. And the other side also being true is your deer are resource limited. They are close to carrying capacity, or there's at least some density dependence happening there. And I wager that in that situation, if I had the acreage and a willing landowner in the coastal plain, I could consistently grow 150, 160 inch deer with an extremely low deer density. Probably a quarter of what most properties have, or maybe less, just to be able to spread out those mouths enough so that there is enough of those high quality forbs available to those individuals.
Yeah, I think something we should talk about for that point is that can be done, but where are you going to find the willing landowner to shoot those deer? I mean, that's what I see the problem is, especially, and I think sometimes it's it's easy for us to get caught up in like what the recommendations are and how we present those to landowners, and I mean, y'all tell me if I'm wrong, but I see a lot more success with clubs. If we've got a big club of people, we're going to have 1 or 2, 3 killers in there that are good for, 10, 15 does a year if we can get them some tags and things like that. But with the single landowner that has a fairly large block, I see we struggle a lot with getting doe harvest in, and it's just because of the separation of work. I mean, it all falls on one person. It's hard to kill 30, 40 deer a year by yourself. And I think that speaks to another problem kind of with what we've been experienced with hunting as well. And we talked about this some the other night, Bronson, at that event, is just the willingness of people now to invite others to hunt on their property, to help harvest does. I think there's a lot of, kind of problems with the system that have allowed a lot of this to happen. I mean, I don't know how y'all feel about that, but again, it's just going to be really, really hard to find a single large landowner who is extremely busy because they have the job or the means to afford the land, so they have to be busy. How do we get them out there, theoretically at least 15 to 20 days and only shoot does? Or like we talked about yesterday, Bronson, some poor quality bucks.
Mm-hmm. But I think all of that you can overcome if you think outside the box a little bit. So you're going to have to turn loose some of your willingness or wanting to hoard everything and all of the harvest decisions. You're going to have to trust in a few people and let them, doe only.
Yep.
And then you think, well, legally there's only so many doe. Well, especially if you're in the Southeast, most every state wildlife agency, if you're part of a program like DMAP, you can typically get additional tags on private lands. And there's a lot of hungry people out there that would love to have venison. And so it's just working with your club members, family members, etc., friends that hunt the property, working with your community. But, where there is a will, there's a way. And to me, we keep dancing around the central theme, to me, is that the best deer management is very vanilla. And it doesn't get a lot of sensationalism at all. Some of the most important things that we can do is manage deer density. And, and I make this joke quite a bit that, there's no diet pill with deer management.
You mean you can't pour out something out of a bag to make them antlers way bigger?
There's no product that you might see on Instagram, and if I just do that, it's the work. It is the year in, year out work of managing deer density. And even if you lease land, and you may listen to us, and I wish I could do all the habitat management, but we can't because we lease it, understand. But one thing you can control is deer density.
Yep.
And that's really boring, and people get tired of hearing it, but it does not negate the importance of it.
Yeah. You may not be able to do anything with the habitat, but you can flex that trigger finger. Also, it kind of seems to me, Bronson, it's kind of more the tortoise and the hare. The tortoise is going to end up winning the race. Steady doe harvest over a long period of time. We can make huge exponential jumps in like pounds per acre of food, habitat, all of that. But you're still going to have to be consistent across time with that. You can't just make the one jump in a 2-year period and expect to start killing really, really big deer. It would take, somebody being consistent over 10 years would probably have more success than somebody that's very inconsistent that blows up once every 5 years. They get fired up about it, do a lot of habitat improvements, and then they walk away for 3. The tortoise is gonna win.
That's right.
So we're kind of talking right now about resource availability for animals to reach their full potential. The other side of this that sometimes I think gets passed over is the fact that the more deer you shoot, the more deer you produce. Because of density dependence, deer being a very density dependent species, if you kill more deer, you will have more successful reproduction the next year. That's been proven time and time again. You not only see an increase in quality pretty immediately with body size and eventually with antler size, but you have more reproduction. And I don't think it's coincidence. If you look at, and I've done this with several states, looking at the estimated population size for those states using state agency data, and some of that is, it varies by state how they calculate it. Using that number and then using harvest numbers, and some of the best quality states from an antler standpoint, I'm talking, those Midwestern states, Ohio being one, for instance. All of them have historically been high harvest states.
Yeah.
People whack the deer in Midwestern states. For the guys who haven't hunted there or lived there or spent time, when gun season starts, and my experience is with Indiana, but man, it's a pumpkin patch. There's people everywhere. There's a heavy tradition of hunting, and like they light them up. And I don't think it's any accident that those states that have always had a heavy hunting tradition, small wood lots and areas where deer really get whacked, when you look at reproduction numbers, it's hard to tease out what states are better than others. But in general, those, there's some Midwestern states. I believe Wisconsin has historically had a little bit higher reproduction rate, at least measured, than some of the other, southern states at least. And a marker of a healthy deer herd is having a lot of turnover. And that's one thing we look at, and at some point we'll do a podcast talking specifically about the deer data we collect and how we analyze it. And there's a bunch of different ways you can look at deer data to try to parse out what's happening with a deer herd. And a lot of that's looking at trends. But one of those, and some state agencies use this as a metric for deer herd health, but one of it's just how much of that harvest is yearling does. Because generally doe harvest is somewhat random. people often shoot for the bigger donor group, but body size is highly variable by individuals. It's somewhat random. And when you start to get in the 20-30% range of doe harvest being yearlings, you're in a pretty good area. But when we walk onto a property that has been poorly managed, poorly harvested, it'll be like 10% or less. And it's just because you have all these old deer that aren't successfully reproducing. You have a stagnated population. Therefore, that's telling you deer are stressed, they're nutritionally stressed, and you're not having new bucks enter that population.
Yeah, tie that back into lactation as well. You know, if lactation's in the tank, 9 times out of 10, it's because they hadn't been shooting enough deer in the past, 5 to 10 years. And you see a quick response with lactation as well, after you start harvesting deer. It's like you said, Moriah, a guy in my community, he's always said this, and he has no, obviously no biological training or anything like that, but he'd always say, the more you shoot, the more they are, you know, just everywhere you hunt, more you shoot, the more they are. And I always remember, I'll always remember that because he's seen that enough times that he knows it. He doesn't now, he might not know why, and he might not know what the contributing factors are, but he knows. He's like, if I go somewhere and I shoot more, the more deer I shoot, the more they are next year.
Most people, I don't think, understand that at all. There's like an undertone assumption when you're on social media and people get on the subject of deer harvest that, like, if they shoot 10 extra deer this year, there will be 10 less next year. Or, like, oh, if I just don't shoot a couple for a few years, they'll be everywhere. And it's like, well, man, I honestly believe a lot of deer herds, and I've heard this from people I look up to, and people I really respect, state agency deer biologists in other states, that there's a lot of markers in a lot of states, reproductive wise, harvest wise, that would suggest that deer harvest is pretty much compensatory at this point. Like, we're not shooting enough deer to really make much of a difference. In other words, the number of deer we're shooting now versus how many we would have to shoot to actually reduce the population, there's a chasm between those two. Simply shooting an extra one, that most hunters shooting an extra one, wouldn't make much of a difference that you would ever even be able to tell. Like, we're so far from actually keeping deer populations down.
Yeah, that's real apparent when you look at harvest data, and just lucky enough to be able to do that for a couple decades. And it was essentially, you could look, and Moriah, you used the term of density dependence, and that's really just a response of the population to a change in density. But the change in density has to be meaningful, meaning it has to change the fundamental relationship between the number of mouths and the food that's available. And what we found, even in real productive environments, that when you just bump up your deer harvest 10 to 20% the next year, even though that was a lot more deer you killed, it was a lot more work, on your part, it was not enough to trigger a density-dependent response. It was like you needed to double, sometimes triple that amount. And then there might even be, and this can be real perplexing for people, when they're wanting to, we did all this work, now the next year we ought to see a big response. Usually there's a lag of 2 years and sometimes 3 years, because now we got to let the habitat recover. And we got to let deer take advantage now of this new food availability, and then they will express that in body weight, lactation, antlers, and so forth. So a lot of people find it overwhelming, and it is a big change. The other thing, I agree with you, Bonner, what you said, but I think the way I would put some context on that would be, you keep shooting them, and I don't remember how you said it exactly. Keep shooting, they're going to keep coming, they're going to be there. I would say for a lot of people, the next year that would be true. A lot of people, when they start standing on the population and harvesting more, well, then deer start responding behaviorally, and a lot of people don't like that. The one benefit of having a very, very dense population is that a lot of people simply enjoy seeing a whole bunch of deer. We deal with that all the time with people. And I love it when we talk to people that have listened and read and followed the stuff we talk about. Moriah, I remember we were with a client that just said it. It was like, I know, I get it. We could kill more deer. We could do a better job with that. But we like seeing deer. I have no problem with that, as long as there's an understanding of the seesaw, the density, food availability relationship. And okay, if you fit that into your situation and you want to see 5 to 15 deer every time you hunt, okay with me. That's all right, as long as you recognize the consequence and the repercussions of that. That's okay.
Yeah. The trade-offs, yeah.
The trade-off. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of kind of tangential in that the property I'm thinking of is a lot more of an exception than the norm for most landowners, but I've been on a couple of properties, and in addition to those, I think of some state parks where I've been over the years in a couple different states that didn't allow hunting in their parks. And these being very drastic examples of what happens when you don't shoot does, period, or you're not shooting near enough. But I've been on a couple properties that was their hunting strategy. Like I remember one growing up, before I really even went to school and studied it. And I remember thinking how much the hunting sucked on that property. All you saw was does. I mean, you would see groups of 10, 12 does just come in and devour this guy's bait piles that he was using to, and his logic was he was gonna bring in the bucks. And I remember hunting there over a weekend and seeing 50, 60 deer and not seeing a single antler. He had stockpiled so many does that no doubt bucks obviously were there during the rut for breeding opportunities. But outside of that, from a buck's perspective, why would you stay in this small core area that had very little resources and really high competition for resources? And I think in some ways when the pendulum swings the other way, where people really don't harvest those and they dig into this mindset of stockpiling deer to make this area where there's just so many deer and bucks are coming in, that can backfire and make your hunting even worse, and maybe even your buck hunting even worse. In a different property where I had access to this data, or have reviewed their data, it's well over 10,000 acres, and they've had a very strict deer harvest program on that property for a long time, but they've had a hard time getting people to shoot does. They've really under-harvested their does, and they have a high deer density. And then they have this restriction on buck harvest that tends to high grade their population. And so over time, you can actually see in their deer data, they've had low doe harvest, and their buck harvest has been getting worse and worse, not only from the number of animals shot, but also from the quality of those animals. And, we're talking 3.5-year-old deer that aren't getting out of the teens, and that's routine for them. Like, to shoot a deer into the 130s or 140s is an exceptional buck on a Midwestern property. And so in that being an example of like, man, not only is doe harvest really important, I think most people are shooting some to keep the population turning over. They're not doing super great. They're not doing super bad. And we are always focused on what it could be like if you did super great and that property population was cranking. What I'm talking about is like the other side of the coin, when a property stagnates. And that's a real thing. Like, I've seen that multiple times. I'm curious if either of you have seen that on properties you can think of.
I think it's the norm. I don't know if stagnate is the right word. I think that certainly can be appropriate. I would say I think it's the norm that it's an equilibrium. That they have reached a new norm based on the number of deer that are there and the extent to which the habitat is managed and the acreage of food plots that are provided. Is that there is not going to be any noticeable change until something overwhelmingly changes. And whether it's adding food to the system or removing mouths from the existing food supply, That is the only way there's going to be a change, is doing that. And it's not just a little dab is going to do you. It's got to be an overwhelming change. Big change on the deer side requires big change on the habitat side. And I don't think people are doing it near enough to cause a big change. It's hard. It's a lot of work, but that you got to recognize that's just the way it is. And circling back, there is no quick fix. There's no product. There's no spray. There's no pouring it out. It requires habitat, producing food, and the number of mouths being appropriate, consuming the amount of food that's available. That's it. All the variation that we see across the United States, eastern United States, is based on that relationship. We got a temperature relationship, heat conservation, heat dissipation. That's never going to change. We can't do anything about that. You know, deer on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and Alabama, no matter how well you manage it, they're never going to be as big as deer from Saskatchewan. That's physics. That's never going to change. But when you remove that variable of temperature, latitude, everything else that we see with deer and the variation in body size and antler size is based on food availability, plain and simple.
And there are ways to facilitate doe harvest, and I'd like for y'all to talk about those just a little bit. Facilitate doe harvest, make it fun, take a little bit of stress off of yourself if you're one of the only people hunting the property, that kind of thing. I get questions all the time: harvest early, harvest late. Should I kill my does first part of the season? Should I kill them after the post rut? All of that. What do I do with my deer? All of these are questions that we get all the time. I mean, do you have any common answers for those, Bronson, that you just give people off the cuff?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest ones. Well, first of all, if you have it really depends on, are you chasing a particular buck? And buddy, I get it. People want to see bucks, they want to harvest bucks. I totally understand that. But let's not devote the entire season to that and neglect the maintenance of that population. So it could be very simple. I mean, there could be 100 ways to do this. It could be that really put pressure on your bow hunters on your property. Wear out does with all the opportunities you have then, and even have a change of philosophy like this. A lot of people look for opening day of youth, muzzleloader, primitive rifle season in the South as that's going to be a good day for some bucks to hit the ground and good opportunity. What a wonderful opportunity. Does are not acclimated to so many people on the property. You might be able to knock out 50% of your doe harvest on the opening weekend of rifle season in 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
Take advantage of that.
A couple doe days are fantastic. Get buddies together, eat good food, shoot some does, hang out, cold beverages in the evening.
That's right.
And yeah, I just think there's a lot of ways to make it easier. Uh, and, and a lot of people, early, late discussion. For me, my typical answer is, I'd rather get them early, but at the same time, it doesn't matter. Just get it done one way or another. It's kind of like, should I do my chores? I've got to do a certain number of things over the fall time for my wife to be happy with me so that she knows I got my chores done. Should I do them early or should I do them late? It doesn't really matter because I got to get them all done, so at a certain point, just get it all done, shoot the does, and reach your harvest goals. And I mean, have fun doing it. I mean, there's plenty of ways to donate deer, whether it's people just down the road. You mentioned the hungry people earlier, Bronson. If you don't know any of the hungry people, there's definitely ways that you can donate deer to get those two people that are in need. And I mean, man, what better way to have a good time, hang out with your buddies, kill a bunch of does, and then at the end of it, I get to have this warm, fuzzy feeling because I'm going to give a lot of this meat to people that need it, that people that don't have, Uh, I love, servicing the community and everything, but maybe sometimes, uh, I'm not, as outgoing enough to go out and just meet different people and help different people that are in need. But I can definitely shoot a couple extra does and donate those.
Absolutely.
I'm all for the early harvest or whatever makes sense to somebody. But there's also some questions around doe harvest that you hear that's like, should you try to shoot old does or young does? Should you shoot them early or late? Some people feel really strongly or bad. I don't know if this is like a they feel this in a moral sense or what, but they feel bad that if they shoot one late season, they're killing the fetuses too. But from a deer management perspective, that really doesn't matter. That deer would have been bred. You can shoot her early, she would have been bred, or you can shoot her late after she's bred. There's really no population difference. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of questions around deer harvest, and I think all of us probably enjoy thinking through those as deer nuts. And we can all overanalyze stuff. I think we're all guilty of that at some point, just because that's what the world we live in. But for the average landowner, whenever those questions come up, my thought process and sometimes response is I'm always at least thinking that question, that level of analyzation of how we harvest does, the when, the who, all that is so far beyond the higher priority of simply doing it. Just put a different way is we're not near, in most cases, we're not to that point where we even need to be worrying about having that discussion, because we would have to be having a baseline of harvest that is shooting enough does before we start to say, okay, now we can sit back with our cold beverage at night and really break down how we're doing this and overanalyze and all. And that is fun. But I think that analysis by paralysis sometimes gets people with the doe harvest thing. And maybe we're just looking for excuses, right? Maybe we just want to think and talk more than we act. But in most cases, it's just not necessary to think about it.
Yeah, definitely more people need to have the Nike mentality, just do it, get it done. But I don't know. I don't know how you really address that with people that don't think doe harvest is important. I mean, it's just really, really tough.
Well, I think it can be certainly property specific, the composition of the hunters, and are they, is it a big bow hunting property, rifle hunting property? But let's also keep this in mind to people that listen to the stuff we and others like us talk about, and we have all this evidence now for huntability of a property and disturbance and hunting pressure and how that changes buck behavior. People have heard that and have seen that and understand that. And so they're trying to reconcile, Moriah, I hear you. We want to do this. But at the same time, I also heard you on the other podcast talk about the disturbance and hunting pressure and changing behavior. And so I think that's, again, where you have to weigh out cost benefit, short term this year, long term years from now. And this is one way. There's a bunch of ways to do it. But the reason I talked about like opening weekend of rifle season is let's have an event. Let's make it an acute event versus chronic, disturbance like that. So let's have that big effort. Let's go ahead and knock out 50, 60, whatever % of the does we need to kill. And then what I like, and I'm biased right here in what I like, but we're the ones also looking at the numbers on the harvest sheet. If you don't get it all done then, I actually really like that closing weekend of deer season, gun season, whatever, is to also kill some more then, because as y'all know, what a wonderful time to assess carcass condition at the end of deer season. So now that is informing us more accurately on this relationship that we're talking about. Do we have enough food on the property or not? for us in Mississippi, that's going to be January 31st is going to close. So that is going to be our last data point we're getting on what is their body size, do they still have fat on their carcass, etc., that we would miss if we just shot all of our does on November 15th. So I think of getting most of it done bow season, opening weekend of gun season, and I'm all for you. You want to sit back and we want to hunt the rut. We don't want to be shooting does off plots, this, that, and the other. Great. Wonderful. In our context in the South, then you might have anywhere from 4 weeks to 8 weeks where you don't need to concentrate as much on doe harvest. But then don't have the issue that a lot of people do, burnout. I killed all those does. I've already got 3 in the freezer. I've been buck hunting. It's like a lot of turkey hunters go, my gosh, I cannot wait until turkey season's over because I'm ready to sleep in one day. People get fatigued, but hunting in a long deer season. But don't neglect that opportunity towards the end of the season to harvest more. And that helps you fill your quota. It's also very influential with us looking at data and being able to interpret what's going on with your deer population. So there's a lot of opportunity to get it done.
So what you're saying is, Bronson, you really like to party the opening weekend of deer season and the closing weekend of deer season.
I want to be at that skin and shed. Yeah. Both those times.
Yeah.
I'll play devil's advocate for a second, and this is where you and I might differ a little bit, Bronson. I think having some at late season is important, but personally, I've seen so many people put it off. They'll put off 50% or more of their harvest to that last weekend, and then almost always in that situation, they just don't make it. And then it's always, well, we'll do better next year. And then the next year comes around, they got some really nice bucks on camera. They're kind of shy with their doe harvest. They put it off again, and it's this never-ending loop. What you said there, if they followed it to a T, I think they would achieve it because they would knock out most of theirs on the opening weekend of rifle. But I've been burned before working with people that say, yeah, we'll do that, and then they get to the end and it doesn't happen. And then I'm sitting there
Moriah,
like,
I'm just saying what should be done. I'm not saying what's going to be done.
Oh, yeah. I'm playing it the other way. I'm like, I know what's going to happen if we do it this way. So, yeah, putting it off sometimes can come back to bite you in the butt.
Yeah, and just for, any listeners that are like, well, I don't think this really applies to me. There are areas across the Southeast that have extremely low deer densities, and maybe you're in an area where, you need to put off doe harvest or, not harvest as many. I think it's important that we say that just because we kind of, we're painting with a broad brush here because most of the areas across the Southeast have too many deer. But I know I've worked in areas where I was like, dang, like they really, like, we couldn't get enough harvest data because they couldn't kill enough deer. And then you start looking at observation data and you're like, my gosh, like they're seeing a deer per 4 hours. Like there are some places where there just aren't any deer. But if you're trying to talk yourself into being one of those people, you're not. You're not. You either know or you don't. But I do think it's important that we do say that, just that there are some areas across the Southeast that are not eat up with deer.
I'm glad you brought that up because it does depend, as irritating as people find that statement, but that's a good example of qualifying that. Every place is not the same. And there absolutely, even in the Southeast, even in Mississippi, there are places where they don't need to stand on the deer population. Yeah, a few does may be completely adequate. There may be even be situations they don't need to have a doe harvest, but that it is so context specific. Yeah.
Well, y'all ready to put the soapboxes away?
For now. Yeah.
Okay. Till next time on the doe harvest. I think there's more we can probably add to that conversation in breaking down the why in the future. It's a big topic.
That's right. But it is critically important. Again, I'll say it again. People roll their eyes and they get tired of hearing a deer biologist talk about doe harvest.
I know.
But the reason deer biologists always talk about doe harvest is because it is so important.
Thanks for listening to the Wildlife Investments Podcast. For more information on these topics or to see some of the projects our team is working on, follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildlife Investments or visit wildlifeinvestments.com.